Sometimes the most ordinary moments reveal the most extraordinary people. What happens when a group of bullies picks the wrong target in front of the wrong witness? In a world where strength is often measured by size and voice, one young woman's quiet courage would meet an unlikely protector whose past held secrets that could change everything. This is the true story of how a chance encounter in a small coffee shop would prove that real strength isn't always visible, and sometimes the most powerful warriors walk among us in plain sight. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of Brewster's Coffee House, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. It was the kind of place where locals gathered before work, where conversations flowed as freely as the coffee, and where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. Sarah Martinez had claimed her usual corner table, laptop open, textbooks scattered around her like a fortress of knowledge. At 22, she was pursuing her master's degree in social work while working part-time at the local community center. Her small frame and quiet demeanor often made people underestimate her, but beneath her soft-spoken exterior lay a determination that had carried her through years of academic excellence despite financial struggles. Sarah's concentration was broken by the familiar chime of the doorbell. She glanced up briefly to see three men entering, their loud voices immediately disrupting the peaceful morning atmosphere. She recognized them from around town. Jake Morrison, Brad Collins, and Mike Stevens. They were known for their aggressive behavior and sense of entitlement that seemed to grow with each passing year since high school. Jake, the apparent leader of the group, stood well over 6 feet with broad shoulders and arms covered in tattoos that told stories of bar fights and questionable decisions. Brad and Mike flanked him like loyal followers, feeding off his energy and amplifying his worst tendencies. The trio made their way to the counter, their presence shifting the entire mood of the coffee shop. Other customers instinctively created distance, conversations became hushed, and the barista's smile became noticeably forced. Sarah tried to refocus on her research paper about intervention strategies for at-risk youth. But their voices carried across the small space, making concentration impossible. Yeah, so I told that boss of mine exactly what I thought of his new policy. Jake's voice boomed as he leaned against the counter. Some people just don't understand respect, you know. They think they can push people around just because they have a little authority. The irony of his statement wasn't lost on Sarah, who had witnessed Jake and his friends demonstrate the exact behavior he was criticizing. She had seen them intimidate younger kids, harass servers at local restaurants, and generally make themselves unwelcome wherever they went. Their reputation in the small town of Millfield was well established, and most people had learned to simply avoid them rather than confront their behavior. As Jake waited for his order, his attention wandered around the coffee shop until his eyes settled on Sarah. She could feel his gaze but kept her eyes fixed on her laptop screen, hoping to remain invisible. Unfortunately, invisibility wasn't an option when Jake Morrison decided you were worth his attention. Well, 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 Jake said loudly, nudging Brad with his elbow. Look who we have here. Little Miss Perfect, studying her life away in the corner. Sarah's stomach tightened, but she continued typing, hoping they would lose interest and move on. She had dealt with people like Jake throughout her academic career, those who seemed threatened by others' dedication to bettering themselves. Her strategy had always been to remain calm, avoid engagement, and wait for the situation to pass. Hey, I'm talking to you. Jake's voice grew more aggressive as he approached her table. It's rude to ignore someone when they're being friendly. Brad and Mike followed, forming a semicircle around Sarah's table. The other customers in the coffee shop began to take notice, but true to human nature, they looked away rather than get involved. The barista, a teenager named Emma, watched nervously from behind the counter but seemed frozen by uncertainty about what to do. I'm just trying to study, Sarah said quietly, finally looking up from her laptop. I don't want any trouble. Trouble? Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it.
Who said anything about trouble?
We're just being neighborly. This is a public place, right? We can sit wherever we want. Without invitation, Jake pulled out the chair across from Sarah and sat down heavily. Brad and Mike remained standing, effectively blocking her exit routes. The power dynamic was clearly intentional. 3 large men surrounding one small woman in a way that would make anyone uncomfortable. So what are you studying there, genius? Jake asked, reaching toward her laptop. Let me guess. Something completely useless that won't help you in the real world. Social work. I'm working on my master's degree. Social work? Mike chimed in with a snort. So you want to save the world, huh?
Think you're better than everyone else because you're getting some fancy degree?
That's not what I think at all, Sarah replied, her voice remaining steady despite the growing anxiety she felt.
I just want to help people.
Like who? People like us? You think we need saving? The conversation was escalating in a direction that Sarah recognized from her studies, a pattern of intimidation designed to assert dominance and elicit fear. She had read about such encounters in textbooks, but experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. Her heart rate increased as she calculated her options. The men were blocking her direct path to the door, and while she could probably squeeze past them, doing so might escalate the situation further. I think everyone deserves support when they need it, Sarah answered carefully, trying to de-escalate without appearing confrontational. Jake leaned forward across the table, his face now uncomfortably close to hers. You know what I think? I think you're one of those people who looks down on folks like us. You sit in your ivory tower with your books and your degrees, thinking you understand how the world works.
That's not true, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper.
It's not? Jake's voice rose. Then prove it. Close that laptop and have a real conversation with us. Show us you're not too good for regular people. The demand was clearly a trap. Sarah understood that closing her laptop would be seen as submission, inviting further escalation. But refusing might be interpreted as confirmation of Jake's accusations about her attitude. She found herself in a no-win situation, which she suspected was exactly what Jake intended. I really need to finish this assignment, she said, trying to maintain her boundaries while not appearing confrontational. I have a deadline. A deadline, Jake repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Must be nice to have such important deadlines. Some of us work real jobs where we deal with real problems. The conversation was attracting more attention from other customers, but still, no one intervened. Sarah noticed an elderly man at a nearby table watching with obvious concern, and a middle-aged woman near the window who kept glancing over nervously. The barista, Emma, had her phone in her hand as if considering whether to call someone, but seemed uncertain about what action to take. I respect that, Sarah said, hoping to find common ground. Everyone's work has value. Do you really? Brad challenged. Because it sure doesn't seem like it. Sitting here all high and mighty with your fancy computer and your college books. Mike added his voice to the chorus. Yeah, acting like you're so much smarter than everyone else. Sarah realized that no response she gave would satisfy them. Their behavior wasn't really about her studying or her degree. It was about power and control. They had identified her as a target they perceived as vulnerable, and they were enjoying the process of intimidation. Her social work training had taught her about this dynamic, but intellectual understanding provided little comfort in the moment. Look, Jake said, his tone becoming more aggressive. I think you owe us an apology for being so rude. We came over here to be friendly, and you've been nothing but stuck up. The demand for an apology was another escalation, designed to humiliate and establish dominance. Sarah felt her options narrowing as the situation became more threatening. She glanced toward the door, calculating whether she could gather her belongings quickly enough to make an escape. But Jake seemed to anticipate her thoughts. Don't even think about running away, he said. We're not done talking yet. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah's training had taught her about fight, flight, or freeze responses, and she found herself firmly in freeze mode, her body tense with adrenaline but her options limited by the physical presence of three men who clearly had no intention of letting her leave peacefully. It was at this moment that the coffee shop door chimed again, and a figure entered that would change everything. The man who walked in appeared unremarkable at first glance. Average height, lean build, wearing simple jeans and a plain grey t-shirt. He had close-cropped hair and moved with a fluid grace that spoke of physical fitness, but nothing about him screamed for attention. He approached the counter and ordered his coffee with a polite nod to Emma, his voice calm and measured. But Sarah noticed something that Jake and his friends missed in their focus on intimidating her. The newcomer's eyes had immediately assessed the entire room upon entering, taking in every detail, including the tense situation unfolding in the corner. His posture appeared relaxed, but there was an alertness about him that suggested he was aware of everything happening around him. I'm waiting for that apology, Jake pressed, his voice growing louder. And maybe you could also admit that you think you're better than everyone else. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her laptop. She could feel tears threatening to form, not from sadness, but from the frustration and fear of being trapped in a situation beyond her control. She had spent years working to overcome challenges, pursuing education as a path to helping others, only to find herself cornered by people who seemed to resent her efforts. Please, she said quietly, I just want to study. I'm not bothering anyone. You're bothering me, Jake declared. Your whole attitude is bothering me. The newcomer at the counter had received his coffee and was adding cream when Jake's voice reached its latest crescendo. Sarah noticed him pause in his stirring, his attention clearly drawn to their table. Unlike the other customers who were pointedly looking away, this man turned slightly to observe the situation more directly. Maybe you need to learn some humility, Mike suggested, emboldened by Jake's leadership. Maybe you need to understand that not everyone's impressed by your college girl act. It's not an act, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. What? Jake leaned even closer. Speak up. If you have something to say it so we can all hear. The newcomer finished preparing his coffee and, instead of finding a table or leaving, began walking slowly in their direction. His movement was casual, almost lazy, but Sarah noticed that his path would bring him very close to their table. She wondered if he was simply looking for a seat or if his approach was more intentional.
I said it's not an act, Sarah repeated, finding a small reserve of courage.
I'm just trying to get an education so I can help people. There's nothing wrong with that. Help people, Jake laughed harshly. Right. Help them do what? Become as weak and pathetic as you? The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt something shift inside her. Despite her fear, despite being outnumbered and intimidated, she found herself unwilling to accept Jake's characterization of her goals and values. Helping people isn't weak, she said, her voice growing stronger. It takes courage to care about others. Courage? Brad scoffed. You wouldn't know courage if it bit you in the... Excuse me. The voice came from directly beside their table, quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority that cut through Brad's insult like a knife. All four of them looked up to see the newcomer standing there, coffee cup in hand, his expression calm but his eyes focused intently on Jake. I couldn't help but notice you gentlemen seem to be having a very intense conversation with this young lady, the man said, his tone conversational but somehow commanding attention. I was wondering if everything was okay over here. Jake straightened in his chair, clearly annoyed by the interruption but also sizing up this new factor in his power game. We're fine, buddy. Just having a friendly chat, nothing that concerns you. The man nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Jake's words carefully. That's good to hear. Because from where I was standing, it looked like 3 grown men were surrounding one young woman who appeared uncomfortable. But if you say it's friendly, then I'm sure she feels perfectly safe and welcome to leave any time she wants. The statement was brilliant in its simplicity. Without directly challenging Jake or making accusations, the man had reframed the entire situation and offered Sarah an exit strategy. All eyes turned to her as the question hung in the air. Did she feel free to leave? Sarah looked at Jake, whose expression had darkened considerably at this unexpected development. She could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his options. The newcomer had disrupted his control of the situation without giving him a clear target for his anger. Of course she's free to leave, Jake said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled irritation. We're not holding her prisoner. Excellent, the man replied with a pleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then you won't mind if I help her gather her things and walk with her to our car. You know, just to make sure she gets there safely. The offer was presented as a courtesy, but everyone at the table understood it as something more significant. The man was inserting himself into the situation as Sarah's protector, fundamentally changing the dynamic that Jake had worked to establish. Jake's face flushed red as the stranger's offer hung in the air. The careful balance of power he had established was crumbling, and Sarah could see the anger building in his eyes. This was the moment she had feared. When a bully's control is challenged, the situation often escalates dramatically. Look, pal, Jake said, standing up slowly from his chair. His considerable height meant to intimidate. I don't know who you think you are, but this is none of your business. Why don't you take your coffee and find somewhere else to drink it? The man remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed but alert. Sarah noticed that despite Jake's imposing size, the stranger didn't seem concerned. In fact, there was something about his stillness that suggested confidence rather than fear. You know what, you're absolutely right, the man said with an easy smile. It's not my business at all. I'm just a guy who believes everyone should feel comfortable enjoying their coffee in peace. He paused, taking a slow sip from his cup while maintaining eye contact with Jake. The gesture was casual, but it demonstrated a complete lack of intimidation that clearly frustrated Jake even more. So, here's what I'm thinking, the man continued. Maybe we can all agree that this young lady should be able to finish her studies without any further interruption, and maybe you gentlemen can enjoy your coffee at your own table. Seems like a win-win situation to me. Brad and Mike exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about how to proceed. They were used to backing up Jake when he targeted people who wouldn't fight back, but this stranger was presenting them with an entirely different dynamic. He wasn't cowering or backing down, but he also wasn't being aggressive or giving them a clear reason to escalate. "Who do you think you are?" Mike demanded, trying to support Jake's position. "Some kind of hero?" The man chuckled, and the sound was genuinely amused. "Hero? No, nothing like that. I'm just a guy who was in the military for a while and learned to notice when situations might be getting out of hand." Sarah's breath caught at the mention of military service. There was something about the way he said it, casual but significant, that suggested his experience might be more extensive than his modest description implied. Jake's eyes narrowed as he processed this information. Military experience could mean anything from a desk job to combat deployment. But something about the stranger's demeanor suggested it might be the latter. "Military, huh?" Jake said, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "Well, thank you for your service, soldier boy, but your tour of duty is over. This is civilian territory now." The man's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed a subtle shift in his posture. It was almost imperceptible, but suddenly he seemed more grounded, more ready for whatever might come next. "You're absolutely right again," the man replied. "This is civilian territory, which means everyone here deserves to feel safe and respected, including her." He nodded towards Sarah, who had been watching the exchange with growing amazement. She had never seen anyone stand up to Jake Morrison like this, with calm authority rather than matching aggression with aggression. "Safe?" Jake laughed, but there was less confidence in it now. "She's perfectly safe. We were just talking." "Right, sweetheart?" The last word was directed at Sarah, and she could hear the implied threat in Jake's tone. He was giving her a chance to defuse the situation by agreeing with his version of events, but also warning her of consequences if she didn't. Before Sarah could respond, the stranger spoke again. "I think she's been pretty clear that she wants to study in peace. But let me ask you something. Are you guys from around here?" The question seemed to come out of nowhere, and Jake looked confused by the sudden change of topic.
Yeah, we're locals.
"Born and raised. What's it to you?" "Just curious," the man said with a friendly nod. "I'm new to the area myself, still learning about the community. But I have to say, if you guys represent the local hospitality, I might be moving to the wrong town." It was a skillful comment that managed to insult their behavior while questioning their representation of the community's values. Sarah could see Jake struggling to find a response that didn't make him look worse. "We represent ourselves just fine," Brad interjected, apparently feeling the need to defend their reputation. "I'm sure you do," the man agreed. "And I'm sure the young lady here represents herself just fine too. Smart, hard-working student, probably making her family proud by pursuing higher education. The kind of person most communities would be proud to claim." The contrast he was drawing was clear without being explicitly stated. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for this stranger who not only protected her but affirmed her worth in the process. Jake was clearly growing frustrated with his inability to regain control of the conversation. "Look, we don't need some outsider telling us how to behave in our own town." "Of course not," the man agreed easily. "Local folks know their community best, which is why I'm sure you understand that making visitors feel unwelcome probably isn't good for local business." He gestured around the coffee shop with his cup. "Place like this probably depends on creating a welcoming atmosphere where people want to spend time and money. Bad for business when customers feel uncomfortable or unsafe." Emma, the teenage barista, had been listening to the entire exchange from behind the counter. Sarah saw her nod slightly at the man's comment about the coffee shop's atmosphere. Other customers were also paying attention now, no longer pretending to ignore the situation. The man's strategy was becoming clear to Sarah. Rather than escalating the confrontation, he was systematically undermining Jake's position by appealing to community values, business interests, and social norms. He was making Jake's behavior seem unreasonable without directly challenging Jake's masculinity or pride. "We weren't making anyone uncomfortable," Mike protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "That's great to hear," the man replied. "Because I'd hate to think that a nice student like this might start studying somewhere else because she felt unwelcome here. And I'd really hate to think that other customers might start avoiding a place where they didn't feel safe." The economic implications of his words weren't lost on anyone. In a small town, reputation mattered, and the coffee shop was likely one of the few gathering places where different social groups intersected. Jake seemed to realize that the situation was slipping completely away from his control. The stranger had turned what should have been a simple intimidation scenario into a complex social and economic issue that made Jake look like the problem rather than the solution. "Fine," Jake said abruptly, stepping back from the table. "We were done here anyway. Come on, guys." But the man wasn't finished.
Before you go, he said pleasantly, I was wondering if you could help me with something. Jake paused, clearly suspicious.
What? Well, I'm still new around here, and I'm trying to understand the local culture.
Is it normal for groups of men to surround young women who are studying alone? Because where I come from, that's considered pretty aggressive behavior. The question was asked with genuine curiosity, but its implications were devastating. He was essentially asking Jake to either defend behavior that everyone knew was wrong or admit that it was inappropriate. Jake's face grew even redder as he struggled with the trap the stranger had laid for him. "We weren't surrounding anyone," he said weakly. The man looked around thoughtfully, as if trying to understand. Because from my perspective, it looked like she was sitting alone, and then 3 guys came over and positioned themselves so she couldn't easily leave her table. Where I trained, we'd call that a tactical disadvantage for her and a position of control for you. Sarah's eyes widened at the phrase, "where I trained." It suggested that his military experience might be more specialized than he had initially implied. "Trained where?" Brad asked, apparently picking up on the same implication. The man shrugged casually. "Different places, different situations. You pick up certain ways of looking at things." His answer was deliberately vague, but something about the way he said it made all 3 men pause. There was an undertone of experience that suggested he might be more than he appeared. Jake was clearly frustrated by his inability to pin down exactly who he was dealing with. "Look, we get it. You don't like how we were talking to her. Message received. We're leaving." "That's very considerate of you," the man replied. "And I'm sure the young lady appreciates being able to finish her studies in peace." As Jake and his friends began to move away from the table, the man turned to Sarah with a completely different demeanor. Gone was the subtle steel that had faced down the bullies, replaced by genuine concern and kindness. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "Do you need a minute to collect yourself before you continue studying?" Sarah nodded, still somewhat in shock from the entire encounter. "Thank you," she managed to say. "You didn't have to do that." "Actually, I kind of did," he replied with a gentle smile. "Part of the job description, you might say." Before Sarah could ask what he meant by that, Jake's voice carried across the coffee shop from near the door. "Hey, military boy," Jake called out, his tone suggesting he wanted one final confrontation. "What's your name, anyway? Since you're so interested in being part of our community." The man turned slowly, and Sarah noticed that his relaxed posture had returned to that subtle alertness she had observed earlier. "Name's David," he replied calmly. "David Harrison." "And you are?" "Jake Morrison." Jake replied with a challenging tone. "And these are my friends, Brad and Mike. We've lived here all our lives and we look out for each other. You might want to remember that." David nodded thoughtfully. "I'll definitely remember that, Jake. Good to know there are people here who look out for each other. That's exactly the kind of community value I was hoping to find." Again, he had turned Jake's implied threat into an affirmation of positive community values, leaving Jake without a clear response. "Whatever," Jake muttered, and pushed through the door with Brad and Mike following. As soon as they were gone, the tension in the coffee shop immediately decreased. Other customers began talking normally again, and Emma came out from behind the counter. "Are you okay, Sarah?" Emma asked, her concern evident. "I'm fine now," Sarah replied, looking up at David, who was still standing beside her table. "Thanks to him." David waved off the credit. "You were handling yourself just fine. You stayed calm, didn't escalate, and maintained your boundaries. That takes real strength." "It didn't feel like strength," Sarah admitted. "It felt like I was trapped. Sometimes strength is just not giving in when people are trying to make you feel small," David said, pulling out the chair that Jake had vacated. "Mind if I sit for a minute? I want to make sure they don't decide to come back." Sarah nodded gratefully. "Please, and thank you again." "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." "Probably nothing too serious," David said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. "But guys like that, they feed off making people feel powerless. Sometimes they just need to be reminded that not everyone's going to let them get away with it." "You seem to know exactly what to say to them," Sarah observed. "Is that something they teach in the military?" David smiled, but there was something guarded about it. "They teach a lot of things in the military. Depends on which part of it you're in." His answer was evasive, but Sarah sensed that pressing for more information might not be welcome. Instead, she decided to share something about herself. "I'm studying to be a social worker," she said. "I spend a lot of time learning about conflict resolution and de-escalation techniques, but experiencing it firsthand is completely different from reading about it in textbooks." "That's important work," David said, and his respect seemed genuine. "Takes a special kind of person to dedicate their life to helping others." "That's what I keep telling myself," Sarah replied with a small laugh. "Especially when people like Jake make me question whether it's worth it." "Trust me," David said, his voice carrying a weight of experience. "It's worth it. The world needs more people willing to step up and help others. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Something about the way he said it made Sarah suspect that he spoke from personal experience about the importance of people who help others. She found herself curious about this man who had appeared at exactly the right moment and seemed to understand both conflict and compassion in equal measure. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said. "Sure. When you mention military training in different places, different situations, what kind of situations were you talking about?" David was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah wondered if she had overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and careful. "I spent some time in places where understanding human behavior could be a matter of life and death," he said. "You learn to read situations quickly, to de-escalate when possible, and to protect people who need protection." It wasn't a complete answer, but it told Sarah enough to understand that David's experience went far beyond typical military service. She found herself wondering what kind of training produced someone who could face down 3 aggressive men with such calm confidence. David and Sarah sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing what had just occurred. Sarah found herself studying this man who had transformed a threatening situation into something manageable with nothing more than words and presence. There was something about him that suggested depths she couldn't quite fathom. "I have to ask," Sarah said finally, "are you some kind of police officer or security specialist?" David shook his head with a slight smile. "Nothing like that. I'm actually between jobs right now, just moved to the area. Still figuring out what comes next." His answer raised more questions than it answered. But before Sarah could probe further, Emma approached their table with a fresh cup of coffee.
"This is on the house," she said, setting the cup in front of David.
"For what you did. Those guys come in here sometimes and always make everyone uncomfortable, but nobody ever stands up to them." "Thank you," David replied. "That's very kind. But I didn't do anything special, just had a conversation." Emma shook her head emphatically. "That was way more than a conversation. I was about to call the police when you stepped in. I've never seen anyone handle Jake Morrison like that." After Emma returned to her work, Sarah leaned forward slightly. "She's right, you know. What you did was remarkable. The way you completely turned the situation around without ever being aggressive or confrontational. I've studied conflict resolution, but I've never seen it applied so effectively in real life." David seemed uncomfortable with the praise. "It's not that complicated. Most bullies are looking for easy targets and simple victories. When you change the dynamics, they usually lose interest pretty quickly. But how did you know it would work with them specifically?"
"Experience, I guess."
You encounter enough different types of people in high-stress situations, you start to recognize patterns. The phrase, high-stress situations, caught Sarah's attention. Combined with his earlier comments about training in different places, it painted a picture of someone with extensive experience in dangerous environments. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone buzzing with a text message. She glanced at the screen and her expression grew troubled. "Everything okay?" David asked, noticing her reaction. "It's my friend Jessica. She works at the diner down the street. She says Jake and his friends just came in and they're talking loudly about some guy who disrespected them at the coffee shop." Sarah looked up at David with concern. "I think they're talking about you." David's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed his posture shift slightly into that alert readiness she had observed before. "What exactly did she say?" "She says they're talking about teaching someone a lesson about minding their own business, and they're asking other people if they know anything about a new guy in town named David." "Interesting," David said calmly. "Sounds like they're not quite ready to let this go." "Aren't you worried?" Sarah asked. "There are 3 of them, and they know this town better than you do." David considered this for a moment. "Can I tell you something about guys like Jake?" Sarah nodded. "They're used to winning through intimidation and superior numbers. They pick fights they know they can win, against people they know won't fight back. But when someone doesn't back down, they're usually not sure what to do next. But they might try to find you later, when you're alone." "They might," David agreed. but I've dealt with worse situations than 3 small-town bullies.
Something in his tone made Sarah believe him completely.
She found herself wondering again about his background and what kind of experiences had given him such confidence in the face of potential threats. Besides, David continued, I have a feeling they're going to think twice about escalating this. What makes you so sure? David smiled. And for the first time, Sarah caught a glimpse of something harder beneath his friendly exterior. 'Cause while they were focused on trying to intimidate you, I was learning quite a bit about them. What do you mean? Body language, speech patterns, group dynamics. Jake's the alpha, but he's not as confident as he pretends to be. Brad and Mike follow his lead, but they're not really committed to serious conflict. They're just along for the ride. When the dynamics change, guys like that usually back down rather than escalate. Sarah was amazed by his analysis. You got all that from one conversation? You learn to read people quickly when your life depends on it, David said simply. The casual reference to life-threatening situations made Sarah even more curious about his background, but she sensed that direct questions wouldn't yield answers. Her phone buzzed again with another message from Jessica. Sarah's eyes widened as she read it. What is it? David asked. Jessica says someone else in the diner just told Jake that there's a new guy in town who lives in the apartment complex on Maple Street. She thinks they might be planning to go there. David nodded thoughtfully. Well, that's interesting, considering I'm staying at the hotel near the highway. You mean they have the wrong information? Completely wrong. Which means they're going to spend time looking for someone who doesn't exist at an address where I don't live. Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony. So, while they're on a wild goose chase, you'll be safely somewhere else. Exactly. Like I said, guys like that usually aren't as smart as they think they are. Despite David's confidence, Sarah still felt concerned. What if they eventually figure out where you're actually staying? David's expression grew serious. Then they'll discover that I'm not as easy a target as they assumed. There was something in his voice that made Sarah certain he wasn't just making empty boasts. Whatever his background, David Harrison was clearly someone who could handle himself in dangerous situations. Can I ask you something personal? Sarah said. You can ask. I might not answer. Fair enough. When you said you spent time in places where understanding human behavior was a matter of life and death, were you talking about combat zones?
David was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah wondered if he was going to answer at all.
Among other places, he said finally. Sometimes the most dangerous situations aren't the ones where people are shooting at you. Sometimes they're the ones where you have to figure out whether someone is a threat before they act on it. That sounds like special operations or intelligence work. David's smile was neither confirmation nor denial. It sounds like someone who's had to make quick decisions about people in complicated circumstances. Sarah realized she wasn't going to get a direct answer about his military background, but his evasiveness told her almost as much as a direct confession would have. People didn't develop his level of situational awareness and calm confidence without extensive training in high-stakes environments. I have to say, Sarah continued, for someone who claims he just had a conversation with those guys, you certainly had a dramatic impact on them. Sometimes the right words at the right time can be more effective than any physical confrontation. Is that something they taught you in whatever training you received? Among other things. David paused, then seemed to make a decision about how much to share. I spent some time with a unit that specialized in situations where traditional military approaches weren't appropriate. You learned to solve problems with minimal force and maximum precision. A unit? Sarah pressed gently. David met her eyes directly. Naval Special Warfare. The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. Naval Special Warfare meant Navy SEALs, elite warriors trained for the most dangerous and sensitive missions imaginable. Suddenly, his calm confidence, his ability to read and manipulate the situation with Jake, and his subtle but unmistakable sense of controlled danger made perfect sense.
You're a Navy SEAL,
Sarah said, not really asking. Was, David corrected, recently retired after 12 years of service. And you just happened to be in the right coffee shop at the right time? Sometimes timing works out that way. Though, I have to say, I probably would have stepped in regardless of my background. What those guys were doing was wrong. Sarah shook her head in amazement. A Navy SEAL. No wonder you weren't intimidated by Jake Morrison and his friends. Training helps, David admitted, but honestly, the bigger factor was just recognizing that they were bullies, not real threats. Bullies fold when you don't give them what they want. Which is? Fear and submission. Take those away, and they don't have much left to work with. Sarah's phone buzzed again, and she checked the message with growing amusement. Jessica says they just left the diner in a hurry, heading toward Maple Street. Apparently, Jake was telling everyone how he's going to teach you some respect. Good luck with that, David said with genuine humor. I hope whoever lives at that address doesn't mind unexpected visitors. I feel like I should warn you that Jake doesn't give up easily. Even if they don't find you tonight, they might keep looking. David's expression grew thoughtful. You know what? Maybe it's time for me to become a more visible member of the community. Hard for them to hunt for someone who's right out in the open. What do you mean? Well, I was planning to spend the next few weeks just relaxing and figuring out what to do next. But maybe I should get more involved locally. Volunteer somewhere, maybe help out with community activities. Sarah's eyes lit up. Actually, I might have an idea about that. The community center where I work is always looking for volunteers, especially people with leadership experience. We run programs for at-risk youth, kids who might benefit from positive male role models. What kind of programs? Mentorship, life skills, conflict resolution. A lot of the kids we work with come from situations where they've learned to solve problems with aggression or violence. They need to see alternatives. That sounds like exactly the kind of work I'd be interested in, David said. And it would definitely make me a visible part of the community. Plus, Sarah added with a smile, it would drive Jake crazy to see you being celebrated for helping people while he's known for intimidating them. An added bonus, David agreed. As they continued talking, Sarah found herself increasingly impressed not just by David's military background, but by his character. He could have used his SEAL training to intimidate or threaten Jake and his friends, but instead he had chosen to de-escalate and protect without violence. Now he was interested in channeling his skills toward helping at-risk youth rather than seeking revenge on his potential adversaries. You know, Sarah said, when I first saw you walk into the coffee shop, you looked like just another regular guy. I never would have guessed you were a Navy SEAL. That's kind of the point, David replied. The best operators are the ones who can blend in anywhere. But when the situation requires it, they can handle whatever comes up. And if Jake and his friends had escalated things beyond verbal intimidation? David's expression grew serious. Then they would have discovered that there are consequences for threatening innocent people. But I'm glad it didn't come to that. Violence should always be a last resort. Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude and respect for this man who had not only protected her, but demonstrated that true strength could be exercised with restraint and wisdom. Jake Morrison thought strength meant using size and aggression to intimidate others, but David Harrison embodied a completely different kind of power, one that protected rather than exploited, and built rather than destroyed. I have to ask, Sarah said, what made you decide to retire from the SEALs? After 12 years of missions around the world, I realized I wanted to focus on building something positive rather than just eliminating threats. Don't get me wrong, that work was important and I'm proud of what we accomplished. But I'm ready for a different kind of challenge. Like working with at-risk youth?
Exactly. Using the same skills to help people build better lives instead of...
He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Instead of other applications. Sarah understood that there were aspects of his military service that David would never discuss. Operations and missions that would remain classified forever. But his desire to transition from warrior to protector and mentor spoke to a depth of character that impressed her even more than his combat credentials. Well, Sarah said, if you're serious about volunteering at the community center, I'd be happy to introduce you to our program director. We could always use someone with your background and skills. I'm absolutely serious, David replied. And I have a feeling that working with kids who need positive role models might be exactly what I need right now too. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the coffee shop windows, Sarah realized that what had started as an ordinary study session had transformed into something much more significant. She had not only been protected by a stranger, but had potentially found a new ally for her work with at-risk youth. And perhaps most importantly, she had witnessed a demonstration of what real strength looked like. Not the bluster and aggression of men like Jake Morrison, but the quiet confidence and protective instinct of someone trained to be a guardian rather than a predator. Jake Morrison and his friends never found David that night, and their failure to locate him became a source of embarrassment that eventually led them to abandon their quest for revenge. David Harrison became a regular volunteer at the community center, where his unique combination of military discipline and genuine compassion made him one of the most effective mentors they had ever had. And Sarah Martinez completed her master's degree with a deeper understanding that sometimes the most extraordinary people walk among us unnoticed until the moment when their true nature is revealed by circumstances that demand nothing less than their absolute best. The incident at Brewster's Coffee House became a turning point for everyone involved, a demonstration that courage comes in many forms, that real strength protects rather than exploits, and that sometimes a single act of intervention can change not just one moment, but the trajectory of multiple lives. In a world where it's easy to look away, David Harrison had shown what happens when someone chooses to step forward. And in doing so, he had proven that the weakest-looking person in the room might actually be under the protection of one of the strongest people you could ever hope to meet.